In a quiet, sunny town, where the usual rhythm of life was suddenly interrupted, an incident occurred that shocked everyone. A white policeman, full of confidence in his rightness, stopped a black woman on the street. In his eyes, she was just another violator, but no one knew that behind this woman there was an incredible story and significant power. She is the mayor of the city, a guardian of justice and law and order. What happened in this fatal moment when the law and personal bias collided before the eyes of the locals? The policeman's confidence quickly turned to confusion when he realized who he was dealing with. But this isn't just a story, it's a moment that raises important questions about racial bias and power. We want to hear from you. Let us know your name and where you're watching from in the comments. Every message you send means a lot to us, and it's your support that helps us grow our channel. You're an integral part of our story, and your participation makes our platform better. Let's figure out this important issue together. Enjoy watching. A warm, sunny morning in a small town was suddenly interrupted by the blaring of a police car. The narrow street, usually bustling with children's laughter and friendly conversations, was momentarily frozen in anticipation. A black woman stood on the sidewalk, ready to cross the street. Her name was Marie, and she had just finished her morning jog and was heading to a meeting with local business owners. But her day was about to change forever. "Hey, you! Stop!" came the voice of a policeman who jumped out of the car like a shadow ready to swallow the light. He was white, with rough features and a confident, even insolent look. "What's the matter?" Marie asked warily, feeling a cold lump growing in her chest. "I'm just going to a meeting." "You were crossing the street on a red light. I have to stop you," the policeman replied with a confident gesture, taking a step toward her. "That's not true. I was looking at the traffic light. Look at me. I didn't break anything." Marie was perplexed. How could she have become the target of such an absurd accusation? The policeman frowned, ignoring her protest. "You'll have to come with me anyway. I have instructions," he said, taking handcuffs out of his pocket. "An order? From whom? This is absurd." Her voice rang with anger and fear. Marie could not believe that this was happening to her. To the mayor of the city, a person who had always fought for justice. She was about to take out her phone to call the city council, but the policeman jerked her hand sharply. "Be quiet while I speak," he shouted, his eyes shining with anger and the certainty that he was 100% right. Marie felt something break inside her. She knew this was more than a simple misunderstanding. This was racism disguised as the law. The people gathered outside began to whisper, their whispers sounding like a chilling horror. "What's going on?" asked one of the witnesses. "She's the mayor. I have done nothing wrong. Let me go!" Marie screamed, but her voice seemed to vanish into thin air. The policeman did not hear. He was only doing his duty, which, as it seemed to him, did not include being kind or listening. "I'm sure you didn't mean to cause trouble, but now is not the time for talking," he said, handcuffing her wrists. Marie felt her world crumbling. "Where are you taking me? This is all wrong." Apparently, the policeman had no intention of stopping. Not only did he not know she was the mayor, he was blind to the facts that were right before his eyes. He was reveling in his sense of power, which seemed to blind his mind. People gathered in the street began recording the scene on their phones, and the whispers grew louder. "This is illegal," one woman shouted. "You have to let her go." But the policeman seemed to be in his own reality, where only he was right. Marie, with her wrists clenched in cold handcuffs, knew that this was her chance. She had to show them that she was not just a victim, but a woman ready to fight. "I am the mayor of this city," she screamed, her voice like thunder in the silence. "You are breaking the law." But at that moment the policeman just sneered. "Really? Please don't make me laugh. Right now you're just another violator, and I have a job to do." Marie looked at the policeman, her heart pounding with fear and anger. She couldn't believe that her life, her job, and her name didn't matter now. Instead, she was the victim of the prejudice and disregard that often plagued people like her. She felt people gathering around her, their eyes full of curiosity and concern. Every question, every confusion was like knives stabbing at her confidence. "I know my rights," she shouted, hoping her words would make him stop. "This isn't just a violation. This is bias." The policeman, still confident in his authority, tore his gaze from her wrist and looked at the crowd. "All of you," he snapped, his voice thick with contempt. "You just watch and do nothing. If anyone is breaking the law here, it's you, just spectators. Put your phones away." Marie felt her voice break and anger boil in her chest. "This isn't just about me. This is about how you treat people just because of the color of their skin. You can't just go and arrest someone who hasn't committed a crime." The crowd grew tense. Some began to openly protest. "Hey, cop, let her go! You have no right," one of the men shouted, his voice sharp, as if snapping a taut string. The policeman turned around and, momentarily confused, lifted his head to look at the protesters, his face contorted with anger. He said, "Shut up, everyone, I'm not going to listen to you." Then, turning back to Marie, he added, "You think you're the mayor, but right now you're just a trespasser, and I'm the one calling the shots here. That's why you should be fired," a woman in the crowd shouted, causing a wave of approval from the others. "You're incapable of doing your job." Marie felt the pressure on her chest increase, and at the same time she noticed that the policeman was losing control more and more. His confidence, based on his racial prejudices, was beginning to crack at the seams. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," she said, her voice growing more and more confident. "I'm not just the mayor. I represent all the people in this city, all the people who face the same abuses I do. Do you think I'm afraid of you?" He frowned, but his voice no longer sounded so confident. He took a step back, not expecting her to answer like that. Suddenly, another policeman approached the crowd, his face filled with doubt and worry. "Hey, what's going on? Why are you arresting this woman?" he asked, looking around at the assembled people. "She crossed the street on a red light and I'm just doing my job," the first officer replied, but he sounded less confident. "She's the mayor. Do you know who she is?" the second policeman replied, the confusion on his face obvious. "We can't just arrest her." But the first policeman seemed blind to this fact. "I'm doing my job, and you can't stop me." His voice became high-pitched, filled with panic. "I know what I'm doing." Marie felt that this was her chance. "Listen," she said to everyone gathered around. "You must not remain silent. Any one of you could end up in my place. If we do not speak out against injustice, we will never change this system." The crowd began to react to her words. Anger and passion filled them. "We are with you," someone from the back row shouted. "This is unacceptable." The first policeman, sensing that the situation was getting out of control, grabbed her arm tighter and pulled her toward his car. "You don't understand who you're dealing with, and I'm not going to listen to your nonsense." The tears in Marie's eyes quickly dried, and in their place was a steely determination. She knew this wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. "You can't silence me," she said loudly, her words echoing off the nearby buildings. "I will fight for what's right, and you can't stop me." The policeman stopped abruptly, and it was like a clash of two powerful forces. Marie saw some of the bystanders start to emerge from the crowd to stand next to her, ready to support her in this absurd clash. Every moment made the situation more tense, the atmosphere more tense, and the hearts beat faster. Marie knew that this fight was just beginning. The crowd held its breath and tension hung in the air. Marie felt cold sweat running down her back, but determination was blazing inside her. The policeman, looking at the people standing next to her, was clearly panicking, and this gave her strength. "You think I'm here to listen to your nonsense?" he shouted, trying to regain control of the situation, but his voice was shaking, betraying his fear. Marie noticed his hand shaking slightly on the handcuffs. "This is just a game to you, isn't it? How can you stand here and talk about law and order when you're the one breaking it?" Her voice was full of anger, but also confidence. Marie knew this situation wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever experienced injustice, everyone who had suffered from prejudice. One woman in the crowd, standing with her children, shouted, "Get away from her, she's not a criminal," and that seemed to be what the crowd needed to feel a sense of common purpose. People began to show their support, holding up their phones, recording everything that was happening, creating an atmosphere of strength. "Are you sure you want to do this?" the other man said, stepping forward confidently. "There will be consequences. We will not allow this to continue." The first policeman, suddenly losing control, glared at the crowd, as if his authority was under threat. "You all should stay out of this. I can have you all arrested for interfering with police work." His voice grew louder, his confidence evaporating. Marie looked into his eyes and saw that under all that mask of strength there was uncertainty and fear. She took a step forward, ignoring his threats. "Do you think your threats will scare us?" You are just a man in uniform who forgets that he is obliged to serve everyone, regardless of the color of his skin. You will see all this when I make a report on your conduct," he cried with delight. "You are all lawbreakers." At that moment, Marie felt the adrenaline boiling inside her. She realized that this was not just her personal struggle, but an important moment for the entire community. With each passing second, the fear she felt turned to anger, and she realized that she could change the course of events. "I'm not here just for myself," she shouted, addressing the entire crowd. "I'm here to tell you that we will not remain silent any longer. We will not tolerate this lawlessness." The crowd, succumbing to her determination, began to shout slogans: "No to racism, justice for all." Their voices merged into a single cry, and it was like a thunderstorm about to break. The first policeman, still holding her hand, was clearly losing control of the situation. His fellow policeman, watching, came closer. "You shouldn't do this," he said quietly, full of anxiety. "It'll only make things worse." But the policeman who had been given authority pushed him away and, turning to Marie, said, "I can't just let you go. I have to act. Otherwise." His voice was faltering, his fear was growing, and there was more than just anger in his eyes. "Otherwise what? You just lose control?" she cried. Marie knew this was her moment. She felt the fear inside her turn to rage. She couldn't believe this fight was happening before her eyes, and the reality hit her that every day someone was suffering from what was happening here and now. "Let her go!" a woman in the crowd screamed, her voice filled with pain and anger. Marie saw determination appear in the eyes of others. This policeman who was going to let her go was now surrounded by people ready to stand up against injustice. "I won't give up," she said, her voice a challenge. She could feel the tension growing with each passing moment, the policeman's fear growing, the courage of the people around her growing. "You can't just do this to people. We're not victims, we're strong." The crowd began to raise their fists, supporting her words. Every shout, every gesture strengthened the spirit of unity, and the atmosphere became more and more tense. The policeman, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, glanced nervously at his colleagues, who were watching him with bewilderment. "Get out of the way," he shouted, but his voice was no longer so confident. He took a step back, and this was his first sign of fear. Marie, sensing this moment, took another step forward. "Listen, I am not just a mayor. I am the voice of those who cannot speak. I am their strength, and today I am not alone." Her words sounded like a mantra, reflecting the spirit of the entire city. But the policeman, who had lost all his confidence, stepped back, and fear appeared in his eyes. "I'm not going to answer for you," he said, and it seemed like a confession. Marie knew that she was on the edge now, and everything could change at any second. The crowd became even more aggressive, and the atmosphere became filled with danger. "We will not remain silent," one of the men shouted, and the crowd responded with one voice. The fear the policeman felt became obvious, and his actions looked increasingly chaotic. "This is not just my fight anymore. This is everyone's fight," Marie said, and her words echoed through the crowd like a call to action. She was ready to fight, and at that moment, not only she, but the entire city felt the need for change. The situation was heating up like hot iron on an anvil. Marie could feel the policeman's fear becoming more and more obvious, but at the same time she knew that her own fear could quickly grow into something powerful. More and more people gathered around her, and each of them felt the tension growing. The policeman, losing the last of his composure, began to look nervously at the crowd, and then turned his gaze back to Marie, a glint of panic mixed with anger in his eyes. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice full of desperation and determination. "You have no right to detain me." The crowd began to slowly approach, and a threat hung in the air. "You can't do this," one of the men shouted. "We're here to protect you." The policeman took a step back, but as the crowd closed in on him, he shouted, "Put away all those phones. I'm arresting you for interfering with police work." His voice grew increasingly hysterical, as if he knew his authority was crumbling before his eyes. "You can't arrest us for defending an innocent woman," the other man replied, his voice as confident and powerful as thunder. Marie could feel the atmosphere around them growing more explosive. Each of them was ready to fight, and it filled her with pride, but at the same time it made her fear worse. The crowd began chanting, "Justice! Justice!" their voices merging into a single stream, growing like a wave ready to overwhelm everything in its path. The policeman, clearly feeling the growing pressure, slid his gaze over the faces of the people, looking for support and understanding, but instead only encountered angry looks. "Do you really want this to end badly?" he said, but his words sounded like a cry of despair. He no longer looked confident, and his posture betrayed fear. Fear of the crowd, which was beginning to look like a single whole, like a living organism, ready to resist. Suddenly, another man stepped out of the crowd, a local businessman who knew Marie well. "Friends, don't let this policeman intimidate us," he shouted, his voice full of energy. "This isn't just her fight. This is a fight for all of us. We must stand together." His words were taken up by others, and the crowd began to hum again like a beehive. But the policeman, feeling his power slipping, turned his attention sharply to him. "You two are under arrest for incitement," he shouted, and the gesture caused the people to take a step back. Marie felt her heart tighten with fear. She knew the situation could turn violent. "Please don't provoke him," she screamed, her voice full of worry. She didn't want anyone to get hurt because of her arrest. But the policeman, who had lost all hope of control, began to behave aggressively. He pulled out a taser and pointed it at the crowd. "I'm warning you, disperse or I will be forced to use force." His voice sounded threatening, and the air was filled with tension that could be cut with a knife. Marie screamed, "Don't let him intimidate you. We must not be afraid. We are here for justice." Her words seemed to spur the crowd on, and they began to rise, their courage becoming more and more noticeable. But the policeman, seeing that he was losing control, tightened the handcuffs on her hands again and pulled her toward his car. "Are you really going to do this?" she asked, her voice shaking with terror, but her eyes blazing with determination. She knew this could end badly, but she also knew she had to fight. "If you take me away, it will only make the people more angry. They won't stop." The crowd began to rise again, their voices growing louder, and it seemed the whole city knew what was happening. But the policeman, still in control, backed away toward his car. "You're all going to regret this," he shouted, but his voice was losing confidence. At that moment, another cry came from the crowd. "He can't do that. It's illegal," someone shouted, and it had an effect. Marie felt the energy building around her, as if they were all one organism, ready to fight. The fear in the policeman's eyes became obvious and he began to retreat, looking at the people who were gathering in one powerful front. His confidence was fading and anger and panic were filling him. "This can't end well for you," he said, his voice shaking, showing that fear was taking hold of him. At that moment, Marie realized that right now they could change the course of events. Every cry, every word they spoke became part of something bigger. She knew she was not alone, and that was what gave her strength. "We will not be afraid," she shouted, her voice a signal. "We are the force, and we will fight to the end." Around her, people began to rise, and the policeman's fear seemed to become apparent. The situation was becoming increasingly tense, and the fear that had previously made them anxious was now a source of strength. Every person in the crowd understood that they were on the brink of change. The policeman who was squeezing Marie's hand no longer looked confident. His lips were trembling and his eyes were darting from one face to another in the crowd, all of them full of determination. He knew that this situation was out of control, and fear was starting to grow in his heart like a wild bush. "You're all just a swarthy crowd," he exclaimed, and his voice was filled with the same racism that had been lurking in his soul for so long. He didn't realize that his words were only adding fuel to the fire. It was making people even more angry. Marie, feeling her own emotions heating up, looked at him with disdain. "And it's because of people like you that we have problems," she said proudly. "You don't see us as people, you see us as a threat, but we won't remain in the shadow of your fear." The crowd began to murmur in dismay. The people standing nearby could not believe that a police officer was using racial slurs as a way to maintain his power. "We are not just people, we are citizens of this city," someone shouted, his voice echoing through the crowd. The policeman, clearly not expecting such resistance, lost control of himself. "I will arrest you all, every one of you for your part in this disorder," he blurted, his voice shaking with rage. But even he knew that these were merely threats, made out of fear, not power. "You can't intimidate us," a woman in the crowd shouted. She looked determined, her voice a signal to everyone else. "We won't let you treat us like animals." Marie felt the support around her growing. "He wants us to be afraid. He wants us to be silent," she screamed, and her words resonated with the people. Each of them realized that this fight was not just about her. It was a battle for dignity and the right to live. The policeman, turning to his colleagues, no longer knew what to do. "Help me! I can't handle them!" he shouted, and there was fear in his eyes. The fear that he had once used to intimidate others was now reflected in him. One of the other police officers, who had remained silent until now, finally stepped forward. "Stop! You can't treat her like that," he said, his voice firm. "This is wrong. We are here to protect people, not humiliate them." Marie felt hope flare up in her chest. "Thank you," she said, but her voice was filled with fear for everyone standing with her. This policeman looked more human than his colleague. But the first officer, losing his last thread of control, pointed the taser at the crowd again. "You have no right to tell me how to do my job," he shouted, and at that moment his voice became extremely aggressive. His fear became obvious, and that made him even more dangerous. "You're all here because you want to create chaos. It's because of people like you that we have problems in this city," he continued, trying to justify his actions with racism and hatred. He stood right in front of Marie, his eyes full of contempt, and she felt the tension build. "You can't let yourself talk like that and think it's okay," she said, her voice still firm. "Do you really think that's how police officers should behave? You're belittling all of us." The crowd erupted in cheers again. "Justice for all," someone shouted, and it sounded like a powerful anthem against hate. The policeman, sensing that the situation was getting out of control, began to panic. He took a step back, but the crowd began to close in. "Don't come near me," he shouted, his voice sounding like he was struggling with a wild animal trying to escape. "You can't intimidate us," one woman said, her voice firm and determined. She raised her fist in solidarity. Marie felt her own courage grow. "We're here to say we won't tolerate this anymore," she screamed, and her words were echoed by the crowd. People began to move closer, creating a united front, and the policeman, realizing he was losing control, tried to appeal to his colleagues. "Why aren't you supporting me? This is the law." But instead, his colleague, the one who had stood up for Marie, came closer. "This is not the law. This is racism, and we will not tolerate it," he said, his voice a challenge. The policeman, noticing that his support was leaving him, pointed his taser at the crowd again. "I'm not kidding. I'm going to arrest you all," he shouted, his voice shaking with fear. But instead of retreating, the crowd became even more determined. "You can't intimidate us. We stand with Marie," someone shouted. It created a powerful current of solidarity. Marie felt her fear recede and the power of unity fill her. The policeman, realizing he was losing control, began to back away, his voice becoming more and more hysterical. "You are all violators. I will not tolerate this." The crowd became even more aggressive. "We are all here for justice. We will fight," they shouted, and in that moment everyone realized that they were united in their anger against the systemic racism that had oppressed them for so long. "Justice, justice," they shouted again, and the cry became a real anthem of the struggle. The policeman, realizing that his threat was not working, stepped back, his face pale with fear. Marie knew that they were on the brink of something huge. Each of them was ready to fight for their rights and their lives. The fear that had once been on the policeman's side was now his enemy. Marie stepped forward, feeling the strength building inside her. "We will not remain silent while we continue to be humiliated," she said proudly, and this caused a new surge of support. "For Marie, for justice," the crowd shouted, and it was the beginning of a new movement, a movement that could not be stopped. Each of them understood that this was not just her fight, but a fight for dignity and freedom. Marie felt the entire crowd tightening around her, supporting her, but at the same time fear was growing. The policeman, realizing that he was no longer in control of the situation, tried to establish his rules again, but his words only added fuel to the fire. "You all just want to create chaos," he shouted, pointing at the people who had come to her defense. "It's because of you that I have to use force." He tightened his grip on the handcuffs again, as if trying to show his authority. His eyes were full of contempt, and there were shadows of hatred in them. "That's not strength, that's cowardice," one woman in the crowd shouted. Her voice resonated in the air, reminding everyone that they were not alone. "You're attacking a woman because she's black. Do you think that's okay?" The policeman, feeling his reputation crumbling, turned sharply to Marie. "You think you're special? You're just another criminal I'm going to arrest." His words hit her like a blow, and Marie felt her heart clench in pain. "I'm not a criminal, I'm the mayor of this city," she said proudly, but her words only angered the policeman. His face turned red with rage, and he stepped forward, threatening her with a taser. "It doesn't matter who you are, you don't belong here." His voice sounded like a roar. Someone in the crowd shouted, "You think you can treat our mayor like this?" This sparked a storm of protest, but the police officer, realizing he had lost control, took on the role of the aggressor. He pointed his taser at the crowd, and that became the trigger. "Get your hands off her," one of the men shouted, stepping forward. There was determination in his voice, but also fear. "You have no right to arrest her." The policeman, aware that his action could cause violence, did not back down. He released a current that struck the man, causing him to fall to the ground. "That was unnecessary," Marie screamed, her voice shaking with horror. Her heart sank at the fact that she couldn't help. "You're beating up an innocent man." "Innocent people don't protest against the law," the policeman replied, his eyes glowing with the desire for power. He walked away to his car, dragging Marie along with him. "You're just playing with fire." The crowd gathered around began to panic. Some began to take steps back, but others remained, unwilling to retreat. It was the moment when fear and anger combined, creating a storm ready to explode. "This is wrong," one of the women shouted. "You are humiliating us just because we are black." The phrase echoed like a challenge, and the crowd shouted back in support. The policeman, noticing that his actions were only causing more anger, tried again to assert control. "I'm not kidding," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'll arrest you all if you don't disperse." But even he knew he was losing support among his colleagues, who were beginning to question his actions. "You've gone too far," one of them said, stepping forward. This was the turning point. The policeman, feeling his unity being destroyed, became furious again. "You're a traitor. Do you really think they have the right to do this?" he blurted out, and his aggression became obvious. Marie realized that this was not just a quarrel, this was a fight for life. Suddenly the policeman rushed towards Marie, his face contorted with anger. He grabbed her hand and she felt his fingers tighten around her wrist. "You're just playing politics," he said, his eyes full of hatred. She could see his fear turning to rage. "Let me go!" she screamed, but her voice trembled with fear. "You have no right to treat me like this." At that moment, Marie realized that this could be her last chance. The crowd, seeing what was happening, united again. "Don't let him do it," someone shouted, and that became the catalyst. People began to move forward, their anger boiling over. The policeman, realizing that he couldn't handle it alone, tried to intimidate the crowd again. He brandished his taser as if it were his last trump card. "I won't hesitate to use force if necessary." His voice sounded like thunder, but no one was afraid. "We will not be afraid," Marie screamed, her eyes shining with determination. She knew that the fight for her freedom was part of something bigger. It was a fight for all black people who had ever been oppressed. The policeman, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, continued to back away. "You will all regret this," he shouted, but not with the same confidence as before. His face was red with anger and fear, and he did not know what to do. The crowd, emboldened by Marie's courage, began to move closer. "We are here for justice," they shouted, and it sounded like a vow. Each of them knew that this was not just a standoff. This was a movement against systemic racism and oppression. "You can't stop us," someone from the crowd shouted, and it was a powerful challenge. Marie felt a light ignite inside her. "This is our city. This is our life." Finally, the cop, unable to cope with the pressure, took a step back, and this was the beginning of his downfall. His fear and racism, which had once given him power, now turned against him. "We will win," Marie said, her voice becoming the symbol of their fight. The crowd shouted back, a multi-voiced roar that resonated in the air. They knew they would not back down. This night would be the beginning of change. The crowd was gathering around him like clouds before a storm, and the tension was at its breaking point. The policeman, feeling his power slipping away, tightened his grip on the handcuffs again, as if they were the only way to regain control of the situation. His face was contorted with anger and fear, while Marie, unwilling to give in, stood there, looking proudly into his eyes. "You have no right to arrest me," she said with unbearable force, her voice breaking through the muffled sounds of the crowd. But the policeman only smirked, his contempt for her obvious. "You're just a black woman with no rights." he replied, and the hateful words hung in the air like poison gas. The crowd froze in shock. Some looked at each other in bewilderment. In that moment, the policeman's racism was at its most vile. One of the men in the crowd, unable to contain his anger, stepped forward. "How can you say that? She's our mayor," he shouted, sounding as if he were ready to jump to her defense. But the policeman, noticing how his threatening tone had no effect, had already swung his taser. "Get out or I'll arrest you too," he said menacingly, pointing the stun gun at the man. At that moment, the crowd felt fear change shape. Anger was pouring in, but so was the understanding that they were all under threat. "You have no right to violence," a woman in the crowd shouted, her voice full of determination but also fear. She took a step forward, but Marie stopped her with a wave of her hand. "Stop! We cannot give him a reason to be violent," she said, knowing that any movement could spark an explosion. The policeman, seeing that no one was afraid, lost control of himself. He grabbed Marie's hand abruptly and pulled her toward his car. "Are you going to complain about me? I have the right to use force," he shouted, knowing that his words were full of lies. He was beginning to realize that his behavior was leading to violence, but his hatred overshadowed everything. The crowd exploded. People began to advance, but everyone knew they were on the edge. "Don't touch her," someone shouted, and it was like a command. Anger filled the air, and they began to close in, unwilling to retreat. The policeman, feeling his own strength fading, swung the taser again. He fired, but someone grabbed his partner's hand. "Don't shoot! Don't let him attack!" he screamed, and at that moment Marie realized the situation was becoming critical. Marie felt her heart beat faster. "Let me go!" she screamed, but her voice was already full of fear. This fear was rising up from within, and she knew that if the policeman continued, it could end badly. "You have no right to violence," shouted another man who was trying to push his way through the crowd. His eyes were burning with anger. He could no longer stand aside. He began to step forward, but the policeman, seeing that he was losing control, pointed the taser at him again. "I'm going to arrest you all. I'm going to fire you all," he screamed, his voice becoming hysterical. At that moment, someone threw a bottle, and that was the trigger. The policeman, overcome with fear and rage, rushed toward the crowd, waving his taser. The situation was out of control. People started to run. Some threw themselves on the ground, but the anger did not leave the crowd. "Justice!" they shouted despite the fear, their cries reminding of the pressure that was growing in their hearts. The policeman, not realizing that his actions were only making the situation worse, shouted, "You all want to create chaos, and I will stop it." His voice trembled with fear, and this only added fuel to the fire. Marie, feeling that she herself had to do something, screamed, "You have to stop. We are not criminals." Her words pierced the air like a knife. This caused an uproar in the crowd, and they raised their heads again. But the policeman, realizing that his authority was crumbling, grabbed Marie's hand again, preparing to drag her to his car. His anger boiled over, and he shouted, "You think you can get away with this? I'll teach you respect." The shadows of madness flashed in his eyes. Marie felt fear grip her heart, but at the same time a spark of resistance burned inside her. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice becoming more confident. At this point the crowd made itself felt again, and one of the men rushed forward, rushing to help. "Don't touch her, you bastard," he shouted, and this was the beginning of the real fight. The policeman, feeling his control being lost, fired his taser again. It hit one of Marie's defenders and he fell to the ground, screaming in pain. At that moment, fear filled the air again and the crowd screamed, feeling the violence growing. Marie, lost in her feelings, screamed, but her words merged with the screams. She understood that this was not just a fight for herself, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been humiliated and insulted. "Justice for all," they shouted in unison, and it became their powerful slogan. Each of them understood that they were on the threshold of change. The crowd was ready to stand up against violence, against racism, against the entire system that tried to suppress their voices. The policeman, in panic and fear, saw his support disintegrate. His partners began to doubt his actions, and this was the moment when he realized that all his threats were ineffective. "You have no right to do this," one of the officers shouted, backing away from his partner, but the officer's anger only increased. "And he, realizing that he was losing control, again pointed the taser at the crowd. "I'm not kidding," he shouted, his voice hoarse, but even he knew that no one would back down this time. Everyone knew that this moment could be the beginning of something bigger. Marie felt her heart fill with determination. "We will not retreat," she shouted, and her words became a signal for action. Each of them knew that this was not just a skirmish on this street, but a real fight for freedom. The panic in the crowd was growing, and fear seemed to cover everyone like a thick fog. The policeman, aware that his actions were provoking more and more hatred, clutched the stun gun in his hand as if it were his only weapon against the growing rebellion. His face was distorted with hatred and madness as he looked at Marie as if she were a target to be destroyed. "You think you're going to rule here? I'll show you what power is," he shouted, pressing her against his car. Marie felt the cold metal touch her skin, and at that moment her heart stopped. Fear, like a chain, squeezed her throat. She knew that this policeman was ready for anything. The crowd, seeing the situation getting more and more grim, began to press each other, but no one wanted to back down. "Don't let him take her," someone shouted from the depths, and this caused a wave of support. Everyone understood that not only Marie was under threat, but each of them, everyone who had ever felt the oppression of the system. "Get your hands off her," the woman screamed, but the policeman only smirked, as if he enjoyed this power. His eyes blazed with madness, and he couldn't take it anymore, and threw the taser into the crowd again. It hit another man, and he fell to the ground, glistening with pain. Screams of pain and fear rang out through the crowd, and this became a signal for action. "Don't let him do it," someone shouted, and this brought the people together. They began to press forward, their anger boiling like a volcano ready to erupt. But the policeman, feeling his fear turn into rage, grabbed Marie by the shoulders, trying to drown her in his hatred. "You're just a toy in this game. I can do whatever I want to you." His voice became hoarse, like a predator ready to attack. Marie felt everything inside her begin to break. "I'm not a toy. I'm the mayor. I have rights." Her words sounded like a challenge, but the policeman only smirked, his hands squeezing hers like a trap. At that moment, she realized that his hatred was directed not only at her, but at everyone who posed a threat to his system. The crowd, realizing that time was running out, began to move forward. "We will not let you take her," one of the men shouted, and that was the catalyst. They charged, but the policeman, unwilling to back down, began waving his taser again. The situation was escalating. Every time the stun gun sparked, the screams grew louder and the air became tense. The policeman, realizing that he could no longer control the situation, began to act aggressively. "Everyone back, or I will arrest you all." His voice sounded like a thundercloud threatening a storm. But the crowd did not retreat. They could not let this madman take their mayor. "We are for justice," someone shouted, and this cry became a real anthem of their struggle. Each of them felt that this was not just a quarrel, this was a real war against oppression. At that moment, the policeman reached out to Marie again, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You think you're one of them? You're just like everyone else," he said, and his words burned like hot coals. Marie realized that in his eyes, she was just a target, an object he could use for his own twisted purposes. Things reached a climax when someone in the crowd, losing patience, threw a rock at a police officer. It hit his car, and that was the trigger. The officer, feeling his control slipping, turned and threw his taser, aiming it at the rock thrower. "You're all paying for this." His voice was full of rage. Shouts echoed throughout the crowd, and people began pushing and shoving, creating chaos. Marie, feeling time slow down, realized that fear filled her, but also determination. She knew that this moment would determine not only her fate, but the fate of all who fought for justice. "Justice," she screamed, and her words echoed like thunder. The crowd, inspired by her courage, moved forward again, like an ocean ready to swallow everything in its path. The policeman, out of control, reached a dead end. Marie felt her inner strength begin to leave her, but at the same time she knew that she had to fight to the end. She raised her head and her eyes met the policeman who was still squeezing her hand, preparing for the final blow. In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just a fight for herself, but a fight for everyone who had ever been humiliated, for those who had been subjected to violence because of the color of their skin. And although fear filled her, she knew that her voice could be a symbol of change. "We will win," she screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. And at that moment, the crowd screamed in unison again, turning their fear into power. The policeman, realizing that his fear and hatred could no longer control the situation, began to panic. He retreated, his face contorted with rage. But the crowd, having lost all doubt, continued to move forward, toward their common goal, justice and equality. Marie knew this was their last chance. Her eyes lit up with determination. She shouted, "Pull yourself together. We can do this." And her words became a signal to action. Everyone knew they were on the brink of change, and this moment would go down in history. The cop, who had lost everything, fired his taser again in desperation, but this time the crowd was ready. They all knew they would not back down. This was their fight, their time, and this battle, full of fear and violence, was the beginning of something new, a real revolution against oppression. Marie felt the world around her begin to distort, as if reality itself was trying to turn away from the pain and fear that surrounded her. She knew she was standing on the edge of an abyss. Her life and the lives of those who supported her depended on how they dealt with this madness. Every scream, every sound seemed to impose additional chains on her soul. The policeman, realizing he was losing control, charged the crowd again, his hatred and rage spreading like dark clouds foreshadowing a storm. He glanced at Marie, and his eyes blazed with furious fire. "You think you deserve respect? You're nothing, just another dark woman trying to rise above her station." His words pierced the air like knives piercing defenses. The crowd froze for a moment, stunned, but then broke out into angry shouts again. "You have no right to talk like that. We don't agree with you," one of the men shouted, and this became a signal for a new wave of protest. But the policeman, not wanting to listen, squeezed the handcuffs again, and his hand began to shake with hatred. "You think you're one of us? You can't be part of this city. You'll never be one of us." His voice sounded like he was ready to destroy everything around him to prove his point. The hatred that lived inside him was tearing him apart from the inside, and it was turning into violence. Marie, feeling her heart beat faster, looked at the people standing around her. Each of them was ready to fight, and there was a fire of determination in their eyes. But there was something else on the policemen's faces too, fear. They understood that their power was no longer enough to control the situation, and this was becoming even more threatening. The situation was heating up. The crowd continued to press, and at that moment one of the policemen, feeling trapped, swung his arm and threw his partner into the crowd, shouting, "Gather them all! Stop this false justice!" But his voice did not carry confidence. At that moment, one of the men on the front line grabbed his comrade by the arm and, with no restraint in his rage, began to push him back. "You can't intimidate us. We won't remain silent any longer," he shouted, his voice booming. Marie sensed that this was their chance. The policeman, now hysterical, pointed his taser at the crowd again. "I'll make you all feel sorry," he shouted, but the crowd only grew, like an ocean ready to swallow his hatred. Marie, seeing this, realized that fear had become a weapon, but not only against them, it was also a weapon against the policeman himself. At that moment, one of Marie's defenders threw a stone at the policeman, and it became a spark. The blow was accurate. The policeman fell to the ground, and this caused a wave of anger among the people. "Look, he is not as strong as he thinks," someone shouted, and at that moment the crowd was filled with new energy. "Support each other. We can't let them intimidate us," Marie screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos, and people began to act as one. But a policeman, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, turned on his siren, and the sound echoed like a curse throughout the area. The sound of the siren took some people's breath away, and panic broke out in the crowd. The police, who had received the call for help, began to surround the square like predators ready to tear their prey apart. "Everyone back, otherwise, you will all be arrested." Their voices were full of threats and hatred. Marie knew they couldn't afford to back down. At that moment, she took a step forward, her voice even more powerful. "Don't be afraid. They may intimidate us, but we stand for the truth." Her words resonated like a bell ringing in the silence. She saw some people starting to gather, ready to follow her. But the policeman, rising from the ground, pointed the stun gun at Marie again, his hatred growing. "You don't deserve this. You can't rule over us," he screamed, and there was a fury in his eyes that could have burned everything around him. At that moment, the crowd began to scream again, and Marie felt the anger wash over her like a wave. She stepped closer, her heart pounding, but she wasn't going to back down. "You can't intimidate us. We're here to fight for justice." Her voice sounded like a sword ready to cut through chains. The policeman, realizing that his words were no longer effective, suddenly began to scream hysterically, "I will arrest you all. I will destroy you all." His voice became wild, like a wild animal, and this behavior frightened the crowd even more. They knew that this man would stop at nothing, and his hatred was ready to spill out on everyone. And then, when all seemed lost, one of the cops' partners finally showed doubt. "Hey, you can't just do that to them. It's not right." His words were full of excitement, and it gave the crowd new hope. But the cop, feeling betrayed, turned on his colleague with fury. "You will pay for this," he screamed, and his hands reached for the taser again. The crowd, seeing this, began to move again. Anger flared up like a fire, and they began to advance, bringing all their fears and hopes down on the policeman. "Justice, justice," they chanted in unison, and this cry, filled with anger, became their only weapon. Marie, sensing that this was their moment, raised her hand as if calling for them to stop. "We will not fight hate, but we will not be silent either. We demand respect." Her voice was confident, and it became a signal to many. But the policeman, blinded by rage, threw the taser again, and the sound came like a bolt from the blue. The blow hit one of the defenders, and he fell, writhing in pain. This was the last straw for the crowd, and they began to act like a hurricane that sweeps away everything in its path. But fear was still in the air. The policeman, losing control, began to swing his fists, threatening everyone around him. Every gesture he made was full of hatred, and it intimidated even the bravest. Marie realized that the situation was heating up to the limit, and the thought flashed through her mind that they were on the edge. "Stop!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the roar of the crowd. At that moment, the policeman pointed his taser at the crowd again, and everyone froze in fear. "I will destroy you all." His voice was full of madness, and he seemed ready to jump on anyone who dared to oppose him. Fear filled the space like a shadow, and in that moment Marie realized that each of them had to be ready. She took a step forward, clenching her fists. "We are not afraid of you. We will not remain silent." Her words pierced the air, and it became a new call to action. And when the policeman pointed the taser again, the crowd, ready for action, screamed, "Justice for all," they shouted, and this cry, filled with passion and determination, became their weapon against the darkness. Marie stood at the forefront, feeling the adrenaline coursing through every cell of her body. Every word the police officer spoke was like a bolt of lightning, making her heart pound in unison with the anger that was flaring up in the crowd. Her resolve grew stronger, and the understanding grew within her. They could no longer remain silent. "Justice for all," she screamed again, and in response to her cry the crowd rose up in a single impulse, as if jumping on the very edge of an abyss. Each of them was ready to fight, and fear slowly retreated, replaced by determination. But the policeman, out of control, rushed about in despair, his eyes full of hatred and malice. "You have no right to be here. I will make you pay for this." His words sounded like a curse, and he pointed the taser at the crowd again. But at that moment, one of the men standing next to Marie stepped forward. His face was determined. There was a fire in his eyes. "We are here to change this. You cannot scare us," he shouted, and his voice filled the air with determination. The police officer, enraged, threw the stun gun at him. It hit him in the chest and he fell to the ground, writhing in pain. "See what happens when you disobey," the officer yelled, his voice like a thunderclap. But instead of being scared, the crowd only increased their shouts. "We will not be silent. We will not retreat," they shouted in unison, and it became a real manifesto of their struggle. Marie felt that this moment had become a turning point. She understood that their unity was stronger than the policeman's hatred. The situation was getting more heated by the second. The police officers who had arrived to help their partner began to surround the crowd. Their faces were full of determination, and with every step they took, the hatred grew. "Get them out, these black rioters," one of the policemen shouted, and this only added fuel to the fire. Marie saw some of her supporters start to tremble in fear, and it reminded her that hatred is a vicious beast that knows no bounds. She stepped forward, gathering all the strength she had. "We are here to stand up for our rights. Don't let them intimidate you." Her voice was full of confidence, and it gave people new hope. The crowd began to scream again. The policeman, watching this, lost all control. "I will arrest you all," he shouted, panic in his voice. He knew that their hatred could not be stopped, and this frightened him. Amidst the chaos and anger, Someone in the crowd threw a rock at a police officer. It hit him square in the shoulder, and that was the last straw. The officer swung his taser in anger, but they were ready. "Don't let him scare us," Marie screamed, and that became a call to action. At that moment, the crowd attacked. They began to move forward, like a living being moving on the same wave. The police, sensing the growing danger, began to act more aggressively, trying to hold back the onslaught. Every blow, every cry was full of despair and anger. "We will not give up," someone shouted, and the crowd repeated it like a mantra. There was a fire in their eyes, and it made them invulnerable to fear. The policeman, surrounded by people, began to retreat, his face distorted with rage and fear. "You will all pay for this," he shouted again, but his voice no longer sounded confident. At that moment, one of his partners, who was standing next to him, began to doubt. He saw how the world around him turned upside down, and fear began to creep into his heart. "This is wrong," he said quietly, but the word echoed through the crowd like thunder. Marie caught his eye and knew that this moment could change everything. "Tell your comrades that this is wrong. We don't want violence, but we can't continue to live like this." Her voice sounded like a mantra, and the crowd, sensing her sincerity, supported her again. But the policeman, feeling his power slipping away, became even more aggressive. He returned to Marie and, looking into her eyes, said with hatred, "You think you can change anything? I will destroy you like the others." His words were filled with malice, and he swung the stun gun again. At that moment, something unexpected happened. One of the residents who had gathered for the rally screamed as if he was trying to get free, "Get your hands off her!" And the crowd again fell upon the policeman, and then the excitement spread all around. Each of them felt that this was their time, their moment, when they could express their discontent and hatred. A real battle began around them. The police tried to hold back the crowd, but their strength melted away like snow in the sun. Marie, inspired by this atmosphere, cried out, "We are not here for violence. We are here to stop it." But the hatred that surrounded them seemed insatiable. Every step forward brought more tension and fear. The policeman, unwilling to give in, swung again, threatening everyone around him. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he shouted, and at that moment his eyes sparkled with wild hatred. Marie realized that they were on the verge of changing everything. This conflict was not just a battle between the police and the people, it was a war for justice, which filled every word of hers with power. "We will not wait any longer. We will fight for our rights," she screamed, and this became the final chord in this loud battle. Hatred hung in the air like a fog, but a fire was already burning in the hearts of the people. Fear tried to paralyze them, but they could not stand it any longer. They stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to fight, and every step was filled with hope for a better tomorrow. Marie, clenching her fists, knew that they were not just people. They were symbols. They were a force that could change the world. And when the policeman pointed the taser again, the crowd, as one, rushed forward, ready to fight to the end. Each of them was ready to do anything to change their destiny. And this moment was the beginning of a new era. The situation quickly escalated. The crowd, full of determination and anger, rushed forward, but the police, having received reinforcements, began an organized attack. At this point, Marie's hope began to fade. Bullets whistled through the air, and the world around them was filled with chaos. Police officers armed with shields and batons began pushing people back. "Get back! Get back!" one of them shouted, his words ringing like a death sentence. The crowd, once united, began to crumble under the pressure, and fear hung in the air. Marie tried to hold people together, but her voice was drowned out by the screams and sounds of struggle. "Don't retreat!" she screamed, but her words were like a drop in the ocean. People, terrified by the police's fury, began to panic. "They'll kill us! Let's get out of here!" came from the crowd, and this caused more unrest. Marie felt her heart sink with fear. The police, taking advantage of the panic, began to disperse the crowd with ruthless determination. "Put your hands on the ground," came from the loudspeakers, and the order hung in the air like a thundercloud. A real struggle began around them. People fell, and cries of pain mixed with angry shouts. Marie couldn't believe that all this was happening. She saw one of her friends being grabbed by a policeman and thrown to the ground without mercy. "Let him go!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in a general scream. The policeman, seeing her, cast a contemptuous glance at her. "You think you're in charge here? You're nothing." His words were filled with poisonous hatred. Every second seemed like an eternity. Marie watched the crowd disintegrate, and her own heart sank with fear. The police, testing their power, began to use violence. The sound of batons hitting people was like a hammer hitting iron. Every scream was like a sharp knife piercing her soul. "Gather, let's not give up," Marie shouted, but many of her supporters began to retreat. "They'll kill us. Marie, we can't fight them." She saw utter despair in the eyes of one of her friends. This wasn't just a conflict, it was a massacre where no one could predict the outcome. The police spraying gas filled the air with toxic smoke, and people began coughing, trying to cover their faces. "This is hate. They want to choke us," someone in the crowd shouted, and that made Marie look up again. She understood that this was no longer just a fight for justice, it was a fight for survival. "Don't let them break us," she shouted again, but her words could not break the veil of fear that enveloped the people. At that moment, it occurred to her that if they did not unite now, they would all lose everything they had fought for. The police began to surround the rest, tightening the circle around Marie and her friends. She felt her chest tighten with panic. "What should we do?" someone shouted, but Marie couldn't find an answer. Every moment they lost more supporters, and those who remained seemed more desperate. Suddenly one of the policemen grabbed her friend, and the sound of a thump rang through the air as he hit him in the stomach. "No! Let him go!" she screamed, but that only drew the attention of the other policemen to her. They turned their gazes, and the hatred she saw in their eyes pierced her like a cold sword. "You think you can save him? You can't even save yourself." One of the policemen started to approach her, and her heart sank. She knew that they were ready to do anything to suppress any resistance. Marie felt fear and despair tightening in her chest, but she couldn't give up. And yet the crowd continued to give in to the pressure. People who had been determined just a second ago were now trying to escape the trap in panic. The police used this to their advantage, and Marie knew that time was running out. They began to detain people, taking them aside, and it was like a dark dream from which it was impossible to wake up. "Stop! Don't give in to their fear," she screamed in a last attempt to maintain her courage, but her voice was becoming more and more dejected. Each of her words was like a last spark of hope that could go out at any moment. The crowd, already huddled together, began to subdue. Marie saw one of her friends being grabbed and dragged away. "Help!" His cry was full of pain and fear, and it was the last straw. Her heart sank with fear, and she felt rage begin to flare up inside her. Marie knew they had to act. "Let's fight!" she cried, her voice suddenly thundering through the silence. "We can't let them take us. We're here to fight." But the police, who had lost all patience, began to act again. They began to disperse the crowd even more aggressively, and it was like a hurricane that swept away everything in its path. "You are all under arrest," one of them shouted, and this cry became the final touch to the picture of chaos. Marie felt the world around her begin to crumble. Every blow, every scream filled her with fear, and she knew that if they did not come together, they could lose everything. Hatred and violence surrounded them like waves in the ocean, and it became clear to her that this moment could be decisive. At that moment, the policeman pointed the taser at her again. "You black rat, you think you're something? I'll teach you respect." His voice pierced the air like a cold knife, and at that moment, Marie knew she couldn't wait any longer. She took a step forward, ready to fight this monster. "We will not remain silent. We will not run away," she screamed, and this cry, filled with anger, became the last bastion of hope for those who were still nearby. But the policeman, blinded by hatred, was ready to destroy them, and it seemed like the end of the world. The crowd, in complete confusion, began to disperse little by little, and each step back brought more fear. "We have to leave," someone shouted, and this became the signal for panic. Marie saw how people began to run in different directions, leaving her alone against a policeman who was full of hatred. She knew this was not just a battle, it was a war that had to end, and when she saw the policeman preparing to attack again, her heart filled with rage. She screamed, ready to fight, and this was the last challenge for everyone, but the hatred around them seemed invincible, and every blow, every scream, deepened the gap between them. Marie felt fear fill her, but she knew they had no choice. They had to fight, even if it meant facing a hatred that was greater than she could ever imagine. In that moment, when all seemed lost, she knew she had to be a voice for those who could not speak. Again she took a step forward, and her eyes met the policeman's. In his gaze she saw not just hatred, but also fear, and that gave her confidence. "We will not leave. We will fight." Her words sounded in the air like thunder, and at that moment they became her shield. Marie understood that even if fear took hold of her, she was not alone. Behind her stood those who believed in justice, those who were ready to fight to the end. The policeman, feeling the pressure of the crowd and the desperation, rushed towards Marie. "You think you can change anything? You're just a black woman, and I'm going to make you pay for this." His voice was full of fury. The statement pierced her soul like a dagger, but instead of fear, she felt a surge of energy. "You can try to scare us, but we will never leave." Her voice was unwavering in its determination. In that moment, she realized that her words could matter. This was more than just a fight for her friend, or for herself. This was a fight for everyone who suffered from oppression and hatred. Behind her, the crowd began to gather again, knowing that they alone could not hold back the onslaught. Marie felt the people gain strength again with each word she spoke. "Gather, we are together, and together we are stronger," she shouted, and soon cries of unity answered her call. "Justice, justice," the crowd shouted, and it sounded like an anthem of their struggle. Each of them was ready to stand for their rights, and even the fear that enveloped them became part of their strength. The policeman, seeing the crowd gathering again, began to act with even greater aggression. "Shut up, you have no right to be here." His shouts became ominous, and he swung the taser again, but this time, when he began to attack, Marie and her supporters did not retreat. Instead, they stood shoulder to shoulder, and it was like a shield that could not be penetrated. "You can't stop us. We will fight for our future," she screamed, and in response to her words, the crowd groaned as one. They knew they had power, and that power came from the pain and fear they had all endured. The policeman, who had been full of confidence a few minutes earlier, now seemed confused. His aggressive actions became less confident, and he began to feel the situation slipping away from him. The policemen gathered around him, but they, too, began to feel the tension. "Why are we here? Why do we have to do this?" one of them said, and the question hung in the air like a storm cloud. His doubt, like a drop of water, became more and more noticeable against the background of anger. At that moment, Marie felt that the moment had come. She knew that she had to use this opportunity. "Look at us. We are here because we need justice. We are not criminals. We are people, just like you." Her words sounded like a call to humanity. Some of the policemen began to waver, and it was like a crack in their armor. Marie saw one of them begin to shift from his position. "Listen to her. She's right," he said, and it was like fresh air in a stifling space. The policeman standing in front of Marie felt his rage fading. He clenched his teeth and screamed, but his voice no longer sounded with the same confidence. "I will order you all to disperse." His words sounded weak and unconvincing, like the last cry of a dying animal. But the crowd was not going to retreat. "Justice, justice," they began to chant again, and at that moment Marie realized that it was this unification that could change everything. Every cry, every step forward brought them closer to their goal. They were not just a crowd, they were a movement. Suddenly, thunder roared in the sky and it began to rain. Drops fell like tears onto the ground, washing people's faces, symbolizing a new beginning. "This is a sign," Marie cried. "We are cleansing ourselves of hatred. We are ready for change." Raindrops mixed with sweat and tears, and at that moment hope ignited in the hearts of the people. The policeman, now at a loss for what to do, looked at his comrades. Some of them began to lower their weapons, and this moment seemed to be a turning point. Marie felt her own heart fill with hope. She knew the fight would not end today, but this night could be the beginning of something great. Every step forward was a step toward change, toward a future where hatred would no longer have power over them. But at that moment, when it seemed that light was breaking through the clouds, one of the policemen, having lost the last of his control, suddenly swung again. "I will arrest you all." His cry was filled with panic, and he threw the taser towards the crowd, which again caused chaos. "Run!" Marie screamed, realizing that at that moment, hatred had taken over again, but not everyone was able to escape. The crowd began to disintegrate again, and in the chaos, she lost her friends. The moment she looked at the police who were attacking her supporters, she realized that this could end badly. "No, don't give in," she screamed, but fear took over her voice again, and when she saw the policeman grab her friend, her heart broke. "Let him go!" she screamed, and that cry became the symbol of her entire struggle. But all around them there was total confusion. The police continued to act with fury, and Marie, feeling helpless, understood that now they had to fight not only for themselves, but for all those who had been subjected to violence and injustice. Every blow, every word of hatred they heard became part of this fight. At that moment, when the world around her began to collapse, she knew that she could not leave her friends. "I will not give up. We will fight," she screamed one last time, and in that scream was all her determination and strength. Gathering all her courage, Marie took a step forward. She knew that the fear would never leave them, but they had to fight, and when her voice rang out in unison with the voices of those who were still nearby, she knew that this was only the beginning of their fight. The situation was rapidly deteriorating. Marie stood at the forefront, feeling the fear and tension growing with each passing second. The police, unwilling to give in, began to use force with redoubled fury. Blows were heard, and cries of pain filled the air. "Hey, you black idiot! Do you think your voice will change anything?" one of the policemen shouted, stepping closer to Marie. His eyes were shining with hatred, and his pursed lips made her afraid. "I will not remain silent," she replied, feeling her heart pounding. "You cannot intimidate us. We are here for justice." "Justice?" The policeman laughed as if her words were funny. "You will never understand what real power is. You are a nobody, and you know it." The crowd, once full of determination, began to disperse. Marie heard someone behind her shout, "We have to go. They'll kill us." Her friends' faces were distorted with fear. "No, don't run away," she screamed, trying to keep the people close to her. "We can't give up. We are stronger together." "Harder," another woman cried, her voice shaking with fear. "Don't you understand what they can do to us? They're killing people. Marie, we have to run." The crowd began to panic again, and at that moment several police officers began to push them back. "Run!" someone shouted. Marie felt her own heart squeeze. "No, don't leave me!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos. At that moment, a police officer grabbed her friend Jason and punched him in the face. "You black trash thought you could go out and protest?" he yelled as Jason fell to the ground, face first into the asphalt. "Jason!" Marie screamed, rushing forward, but was stopped by more police officers. "Stop!" one of them yelled, grabbing her shoulder. "Do you know what happens for this?" "I will not remain silent while they beat people," she screamed, feeling anger fill her chest. "You have no right to do this." Another police officer standing nearby just chuckled. "And you, black woman, what are you going to do about it? We're here to maintain order, not listen to your crazy rants." The shouts began again, and someone from the crowd exclaimed, "They are simply killing us." This cry sounded like a challenge, and others began to support it. "Let them kill us, we will still fight," shouted another protester, which spurred on the others. The police began to push people into corners, trying to keep the situation under control, but tensions were rising. "Get back, motherfuckers," one protester shouted after being hit in the stomach with a baton. Marie watched in horror. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. She knew that if they didn't pull together, it could end in tragedy. "They can't stop us. Pull yourself together," she screamed, trying to give the people courage. But all that was heard in response was moans and screams, mixed with the sounds of battle. "Marie, we have to get out of here," her friend Kim cried, her eyes full of tears. "They'll kill us if we stay." "No, Kim, we can't leave. We have to fight," Marie insisted, feeling her strength fading, but the fear in her friend's eyes was infectious. Suddenly, the officer standing closest pulled out a stun gun. "You're all under arrest, and I'm going to start with you," he shouted, pointing the device at Marie. She felt panic rising inside her. "Don't touch her," someone from the crowd shouted, but the policeman only grinned and, without hesitation, pressed the button. Marie felt a shock run through her body and she fell to the ground, unable to move. "Marie!" Kim screamed, rushing towards her, but other police officers grabbed her. "Get away from her. Stupid, there's nothing you can do," one of them growled, pushing her back. Hatred filled the air. Marie lay on the ground, struggling with pain and fear, but deep inside, a spark of hope still burned. She saw her friends captured, and it brought her agony. They will not win. We will not remain silent, she screamed, trying to rise, but her voice sounded weaker. At that moment, it seemed to her that all her strength was leaving her. The police began handcuffing her friends, and the moment seemed endless. She felt trapped, as if her own life had been consigned to oblivion. "You can't break us," she screamed, but it was becoming harder with each passing second. And then, just when hope was fading, one of the policemen approached her, looking doubtful. He glanced at Marie and seemed to begin to understand what they were doing. "Seriously, you really want to do this?" he asked, trying to speak quietly so his colleagues wouldn't hear. "You know it. You have to see what's going on," Marie replied, trying to put all the truth into her words. "You have to understand that this is wrong." "I can't. I'm just following orders," he replied, and this admission left her puzzled. At this point, everyone around them continued to scream and fight. The police began to press on the protesters again, and Marie realized that the fight was just beginning. She knew it was now or never. "We will not leave until we get justice." Her voice, filled with power, sounded in unison with the cries of the crowd. But inside her, anxiety was growing. Their situation was getting worse with each passing second, and she could feel those around her losing hope. The police were becoming more and more aggressive, and the crowd was becoming more and more fearful. Marie knew that if they didn't pull together, they could lose everything. "Come together, we can do this," she cried, and her voice, like a beacon in a stormy sea, began to attract attention. "We have to stay together, for every one of us who is here." But her words sounded more and more desperate. Every moment brought them closer to possible defeat, and fear began to squeeze the hearts of her friends. Marie understood that they could not retreat. Hatred and violence were all around them, and this feeling could consume them at any moment. "I won't let you go," the policeman said, and it was like a blow to her soul. The situation was heating up to the limit, and Marie knew that this was her last chance. She had to do everything possible to ensure that their fight was not in vain. The situation was reaching a critical point, and Marie knew it could all end at any moment. The forces they were fighting seemed insurmountable. The crowd was disorganized. Cries of fear and pain mixed with the noise of sirens. She felt her heart squeeze with fear and helplessness. "Don't give up. We are stronger than they think," Marie screamed, her voice sounding increasingly exhausted, but there was still a spark of hope burning inside her. She knew that this fight was important not only for them, but for future generations. Suddenly, one of the policemen, the one who had seemed hesitant at first, came up to her again. He was still holding the stun gun, but in his eyes Marie saw something new: hesitation, doubt. "Look, I can't do this anymore," he said quietly, glancing at his colleagues who were focused on quelling the crowd. "I know this is wrong. I shouldn't do this." These words filled Marie with hope. "If you understand this, then help us," she cried. "You can do it. We are all human beings, and we have the right to be protected." The policeman, knowing deep down that she was right, hesitated. He glanced at his other colleagues, who were acting with hatred and aggression, and returned to Marie. But at that moment the tension reached its limit. One of the policemen, seeing that his colleague was beginning to waver, jumped up and shouted, "What are you doing? We can't allow this," and hit the hesitant policeman in the face. Marie screamed in horror as the policeman fell to the ground. "No! What are you doing?" Her voice was filled with despair. Screams erupted around them and the crowd began to panic again. "Run!" one of the protesters screamed, and many of them began to run in different directions. Marie, feeling everything falling apart, could not believe what was happening. "No! We cannot give up!" she screamed, and her voice was the last cry of hope in the chaos. But her words did not reach those who were running in panic, who had lost faith in victory. The police, feeling that control was slipping away from them, began to act with even greater brutality. They rushed into the crowd, waving batons and stun guns. Marie screamed, trying to reach her friends, but she had no strength. She watched as her friends fell one by one, and the sense of loss was unbearable. Loud sirens filled the air, and additional forces began to flock to the protest site. With her hands clasped in prayer, she looked one last time at the people who remained by her side. In their eyes, she saw the same determination that burned in her heart. "Pull yourself together," she cried, but her voice was weak. In that moment, as they stood surrounded by violence and hatred, she realized that their fight would continue. This was not the end, it was just the first step toward change. We are not alone. We will fight for justice, she said, although her words sounded weak, but there was still hope in them. Marie knew that they might lose the battle, but they would not lose the war. Every cry, every action, every word was a step towards changing society. And in that moment, she realized that even if the situation now seemed hopeless, hope would not disappear. With the crowd running in all directions and the police acting with fury, Marie knew that they might all be in darkness, but perhaps there was still a spark of light burning in their hearts. With that thought, even as her world was falling apart, she continued to believe in the power of unity, and that was the power that could change everything. And even though she might lose friends, she couldn't afford to lose hope. Marie stood in the chaos, her heart heavy with grief and worry, but a spark of hope still burning within her. She understood that the fight they were waging was more than just her personal story. It was a fight for justice, for equality, and for the future. She heard the crowd's cries growing more distant, and more people running for safety, but she couldn't allow herself to panic. "We're not alone," she screamed again, though her voice was growing weaker. "We can't give up." At that moment she saw her friend Jason, who, although badly hurt, had risen to his feet and was looking at her with determination. "Marie," he shouted, "you're right, we have to stay together." Her heart began to beat faster as she saw some of the protesters begin to return, encouraging each other. "Get together, we will not be silent." Voices rang out, and this spurred on the others. The police, seeing the protesters gathering again, began to panic. The hatred that fueled them clashed with the unwavering determination of those who believed in change. Every cry, every word, every movement became a symbol of the fight for justice. But at that moment, when everything seemed on the brink, the sound of sirens was heard, and additional forces arrived at the protest site. It was the beginning of a new era of violence and fear. Marie felt her heart stop. She became afraid for her friends, for all those who came to support justice. At that moment, she made a decision. "We will not leave," she cried, looking at her friends, and in their eyes she saw the same determination that burned in her heart. "We will fight, all of us." And although everything around them seemed doomed, they stood together, holding hands tightly. In their hearts burned a hope that was stronger than any fear. Marie knew this battle would be long and hard, but despite the fear and violence, they were not alone. And even as the world crumbled around them, they found the strength to carry on. Together, despite everything, they would fight for justice, and this was only the beginning of their journey. And thank you for watching our story. Your opinion is very important to us. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? We would like to hear your stories and thoughts. You are very, very important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Your support helps us grow our channel and continue to raise important topics. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video if you enjoyed it. Have a nice day and look forward to seeing your comments.